Yeah, so that's our little starter video for all of our webinar Wednesdays. So this webinar Wednesday is all about non-formal education in Erasmus Plus projects. And then just to highlight who is in the room. So my name is Audrey, I work for Léargas, and I'm here kind of to coordinate just the technical aspects of the day-to-day. And then we have Nora and Hilary who will be guiding you through the actual content of the webinar. And they can introduce themselves as well in a moment. And then just to go through some housekeeping before we get started. So I think it's really important that you mute your microphones when other people are speaking. I will possibly mute people in case there is some background noise, so don't be offended. If you're talking, obviously I won't mute you. And then just to say, we have a really tight time frame, so it is only an hour long, so there's a lot to get through, so we had to keep that in mind as well. And the tips and tools will be given after the session, and then again, just to highlight that we are recording this event for training purposes. And then just also to highlight that, you know, you can use the chat for sharing your ideas or sharing resources, or if you have a question or anything like that, you can use the chat. And then again, just to say to have menti.com open, and then there's also the code is in the chat too. And yeah, I think that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand over to Nora. So over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks a million, Audrey. So hello everyone, great to have you here. Yeah, we've loads to get through in the next hour. And just to give a bit of context, Hilary and I have been collaborating. We're working on a piece of text that will be included in a Salto publication in the next year or so, and there's trainings and etc. going to come from that. And in doing the research and in the many conversations that Hilary and I have had over the past 12 months working on this, I was reminded of so many definitions, resources and ideas that I kind of had lost contact with in recent years, even though at one stage I would have been engaging with them. I kind of forgot about them, or I just didn't have the space to think about them. So what we've gathered today are some of those articles and definitions and resources that emerged from those conversations that we think would be useful for you all to revisit. And we're conscious that some of you are highly experienced in Erasmus Plus and non-formal education, and some people are absolute newcomers. So to some of you, it'll be quite new, and to some of you, hopefully it'll be a good opportunity to reflect and revisit. And everything that we share will be sent out to you in follow-up. So we'll be flying through some things that are just references, but you'll be able to engage with them on a deeper level afterwards if you wish. And for those of you who don't know me, my background is in youth work. I've been delivering a lot of trainings for Léargas for a long number of years now. I contribute to the youth work programme in UCC and to various other youth work programmes via Léargas and ETBs and different institutes. And I practice youth work on a voluntary basis here in Léargas, in the town I live with a group of young people. So I'm trying to constantly practice what I preach, and that my preach is informed by practice at the same time. Hilary, do you want to say anything before we go on? Oh, you're on mute.
I was following the rules. So I'm Hilary Tierney. I work in Maynooth University where I teach youth work, but my background is as a youth worker and a youth work educator and trainer. And in the last couple of years in particular, I've become more involved, I suppose, in European youth work. And that's one of the projects that Nora and I are collaborating on, is developing a resource for non-formal learning in youth work. And over the last couple of years as well, I coordinated a KA2 that at least one person in the room contributed to, called Youth Work and You. And so I'll be introducing that very briefly later. But I suppose both of us, when this opportunity came up, were really excited to, I suppose, revisit some of the ideas, the fundamentals of youth work, practice in an age where youth work is being shaped on all sides by funders and policymakers. An opportunity, I suppose, for us to revisit some of the fundamentals of youth work as an educational practice and a learning experience for young people, and how we might sort of develop that understandings together. So that's where I'm coming from.
Super. So I'm going to share my screen now, hopefully effectively. No, wrong screen share. Hang on.
We practiced all of this earlier, I promise.
What do you see now?
What do you know? What do you need to know about non-formal education or in Erasmus Plus projects?
Okay, super. So, yeah, we are going to have a quick look at the aims of what we planned for today. So it's to revisit your understanding of non-formal education, and to reiterate that we're talking about the context of youth work. To deepen your understanding of the principles of non-formal education within Erasmus Plus and European Solidarity Core programs. So we'll really be approaching it from a European perspective. Exploring tools for developing competence in the facilitation of non-formal education programs, and we're going to share some additional tools, trainings and resources that you might find useful as well. Yeah, we wanted to get a sense for all our sakes of who's in the room, so we're going to do our first Mentimeter activity with that. So if you've just recently joined, go to menti.com. And our code is 681744, and you'll see that code written in our group chat. Okay, so the first question is there. You can add what county you're dialing in from this morning. So we have Cork, Wexford, Wicklow, Waterford, Dublin. Anyone else? Another Dubliner. Give you a minute to acquaint yourselves with Mentimeter. If anyone is having a problem with it, feel free to send us a message in our chat.
As I'm sure many of you have discovered in trying to do youth work in the age of COVID, Menti is one of those tools that can be a lot of fun in virtual youth work. It's one of the things that I think a lot of projects are using to set up sort of quizzes and various interactive things with young people.
We have Kilkenny. So we'll give another 5 seconds for people to add to that.
Well, the South and the Southeast is well represented, so I'm pleased about that.
You're doing great. I know we have someone from Galway in the room as well. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next slide now, which asks you to input what type of organisation are you representing. So it should give you options. If you're a youth service, an arts-based service, if you're an individual, just dialing in to increase your knowledge. So most people are dialing in as other, which is really interesting. Okay, majority of people are dialing in as other. Next question. Have you ever been involved in an Erasmus Plus or European Solidarity Core project?
Nora, it's telling me I didn't vote in time and sort of has knocked me off it.
Oh no!
Yeah, sorry. I don't know what that means, but there you go.
There's a time limit, but I thought we'd extended the time limit.
Oh. Good. Oh dear. Okay, well, I'm going to go on to the next slide and hopefully that won't happen. Apologies. Try and answer as fast as you can. So the question asks, do you feel confident in your knowledge of non-formal education? Thanks. So majority are saying yes, a couple of people saying no, and someone's not sure. Okay, so the next one, do you feel confident in your practice of non-formal education? There's only 10 seconds for this one now, so try and respond as soon as you can. Okay, the results are a little bit different. Okay, so we're going to explore the whole idea of the competence of a non-formal educator using the head, heart, hands approach. And I presume most of you are familiar with this approach already, but just a reminder that the head represents the knowledge that's required by the facilitator. The heart represents the values that are required, and the hands represents the skills. So we're just going to spend a couple of minutes exploring and unpacking a little bit what might be entailed in that. So I'm going to ask you to type in what you think are the main values that underpin non-formal education. So you can share a little bit there, what you think those values should be. So the results are coming in. Great, so there's some great responses coming in there that there should be non-judgmental values underpinning non-formal education, that it values life experience and experiential learning through fun activities, values around inclusion, empowerment and learner-centered approaches, learning by doing and active participation, voluntary participation and creative values. Super. Will I keep going? Learning together. Knowledge, patience, non-judgment again. Great. Integrity and purpose. Beautiful list of values. Okay. So a genuine interest, good knowledge, value for lifelong learning, empathy and understanding. Super. So these are exactly the responses we were hoping for. So I'm going to click to the next slide now, which will ask you what skills do you require? So we're focusing on the heart, on the hands, excuse me. So what skills do you think the non-formal educator should have? Super. So we've got skills coming in around active listening, supporting group work, creativity, imagination, thinking outside the box, facilitation, leadership, program design, understanding and empathy of learners, patience, and again, facilitation skills, passion. valuing all previous learning. Facilitation, experiential learning. Yeah, appreciation of the process rather than the outcome. Great, and maybe just to elaborate slightly, I think particularly linked to program design, there's a little bit of skill involved in research and being able to connect with the right resources, which is something that we hope today might address in a way. Okay, so the next slide will ask you what knowledge is required. So we're looking at the head part now. So what knowledge do you think is required of the non-formal educator? Great, so there's some interesting inputs here around the required knowledge of best practice in non-formal education, understanding how people learn, knowledge on particular topics, understanding the needs of your group, icebreakers and games, individual needs, child protection, learning to learn, theories such as Freire and bell hooks, how to facilitate a group, knowledge of the subject being taught, how different people learn, variety of teaching methods, and knowledge of the process. Super, so this is the kind of area we want to tackle in this webinar, is to focus on the knowledge side of what's required by the non-formal educator, to think a little bit about the theory, and perhaps we should see policy pop up there somewhere as well. The policy that's informing practice, and I guess funding is in response to policy, and understanding that as well, the context of non-formal education within Erasmus Plus and European Solidarity Corps, and knowing where to find the information that you need. So we're hoping that some of our resources will pinpoint you into the right direction and signpost you to the right place. And just to really understand, using this head, hearts and hand model, that the competence lies at the core of the model, that facilitators need to be able to draw on and be informed by the right knowledge, and to find space for reflecting on that knowledge side of practice, and that they have the skills to implement, and that they're connecting to the values that underpin their work as well. So the competence lies at the core. And I guess Hilary and I have been speaking a lot about some of the fundamentals of youth work. So just a reminder that we want to understand that youth work is a relational and educational process that supports the young person to develop the confidence, voice and competence to enhance their own personal and social well-being, and that this in turn can increase their capacity to contribute to a more inclusive, equal and just society. That learning is part of the purpose of youth work, and that not all learning has positive outcomes. Learning can also reinforce negative experiences. Positive learning doesn't just happen, and we have to consider that in how we design and plan programs. and that the youth worker is considered educator, and that we need to really work on building our identity and capacity as educators. And in this case, it's as a non-formal educator, which inquires informed skills and competences. Do you want to say anything there, Hilary?
Well, no, just that I think that starting point really is beginning to own in a very positive way our role as educators and the real value of non-formal education, and us as educators then creating learning opportunities for young people. So seeing youth work as a learning environment. And I think we were really taken by that idea that we have to be a sort of awake and aware all the time, because learning happens all the time, whether we have it planned or not. And I suppose that's the other dimension of youth work, which we'll mention here, but not go into detail with, is the notion of informal learning in youth work, so that young people can learn. And it's, I suppose, part of our responsibility to try and ensure that learning is positive learning, that reinforces them sense of self and a sense of agency and a sense of capacity, rather than learning that reinforces negative stereotypes or reinforces negative perceptions of themselves and their own capacity. So it's a big ask for youth workers, I think, to put ourselves in this space. But we think it's increasingly important that we take on that role in a very sort of fulsome sort of way.
Yeah, and I think there's a real risk that if youth work practice, if there isn't space carved out for these kind of reflections and for designing programs carefully, drawing on the right resources, there is a real risk that things just plod along very informally, and that negative stereotypes really can be reinforced. So we have an obligation to take time out to really consider our role and our purpose as non-formal educators in a youth work context. And to reiterate again that in many scenarios, it's really difficult to carve out that time, because there's just so many demands on youth workers and people who work with young people. And that Erasmus Plus and European Solidarity Corps is a real opportunity for us to carve out that space and to implement non-formal learning in an intercultural and in a group context. And to be able to narrate that in funding applications is really important, and will strengthen your application at the same time. So we defining youth work is sometimes challenging, and particularly in a European context, because youth work is so diverse across Europe. And in Ireland, I guess we have such an established field in many ways, given that we have our Youth Work Act and we have a department who hopefully will remain dedicated to children and youth affairs. We have policies in place, and across Europe this isn't the case. But from a Council of Europe perspective, they have written this definition, which we think is really good for harnessing that diversity and vagueness in places. So the definition reads as: youth work is a broad term covering a wide variety of activities of a social, cultural, education, environmental and/or political nature by, with and for young people in groups or individually. Youth work is delivered by paid and volunteer youth workers and is based on non-formal and informal learning processes focused on young people and on voluntary participation. Youth work is essentially a social practice working with young people and the societies in which they live, facilitating young people's active participation and inclusion in their communities and in decision making. So we think this is a really good definition, because it encompasses even a lot of the values that we mentioned earlier and addresses the diversity of practice, covers everything. And specifically it names non-formal and informal learning processes, which suggests that in youth work practice, we can make an assumption that youth workers need to be prepared and need to identify as non-formal educators.
Are there any thoughts about any of that, or any wonders about it? I mean, please, either say something or put in a question or a chat or a comment in the chat as we go along, and we can try and address those as we go along. I mean, as Nora said, like, we're lucky at some level. Certainly a lot of people in Europe think we're very lucky in Ireland to have a definition, but of course the thing about a definition is like who gets to interpret it and who gets to play it out and how it gets played out. And in the European context, it is, you know, it's trying to identify commonalities across a huge range of diversity, but we do think there's a real value in recognizing that youth work, as well as having personal and social outcomes, is also concerned with, and perhaps increasingly concerned with, as we see what's happening around the world, you know, environmental and political, you know, small p issues, the issues that really impact on young people's lives, and that in utilizing non-formal and informal processes in that sort of relational practice is a really key part of that. And for those of you who are interested in that idea of youth work practice, which is of course not what we're talking about today in general terms, but the Youth Partnership and the Council of Europe have a very nice paper on what they call practice architectures. So using some of the ideas from Stephen Kemmis about practice architecture, and we can stick those links up afterwards. But some of you might find that interesting in terms of how youth work as a practice is being explored in the European context.
Super. Yeah, and as Hilary said, feel free to unmute yourselves at any time and make a comment or ask a question. And just to let you know, at the end of the session, we have allocated time for questions and answers as well. Yeah, and the next couple of definitions we're going to look at have come from the Council of Europe glossary, which is a super site and gives really clear definitions to lots of different concepts that we connect with in youth work. And they've really helped me distinguish the difference between non-formal learning and informal learning, because I guess for years I felt like I did know the difference, but maybe I was a bit fuzzy. I didn't have clear lines in distinguishing both. So let's just take a look for a minute now and see will this support you in distinguishing the difference if needs be. So it defines non-formal learning as a purposive but voluntary learning that takes place in a diverse range of environments and situations for which teaching, training and learning is not necessarily their sole or main activity. These environments and situations may be intermittent or transitionary, and the activities, of course, that take place may be staffed by professional learning facilitators such as youth trainers or by volunteers such as youth leaders. The activities and the courses are planned but are seldom structured by conventional rhythms or curriculum subjects. So non-formal learning and education is understood as learning outside institutional contexts, i.e. out of school, is the key activity, but also the key competence of youth work. Non-formal learning and education in youth work is often structured based on learning objectives, learning time, and specific learning support that is intentional. It typically does not lead to certification, but there's an increasing number of cases certificates are delivered, leading to better recognition of the individual's learning outcomes. So some of the words that I take from this definition that really help me understand non-formal learning are words such as purpose and intention and outcomes. So when you're designing a non-formal learning program, my understanding is that learning is definitely a key intention, and that collaboratively you can set learning outcomes, and that you need to be able to measure those learning outcomes and to recognize the learning at individual level as a result. Hilary, you always respond to that.
I think for me, the challenge of all of this is, how do you do this in a way that we don't end up becoming school by any other name? Do you know, that the whole thing becomes so formalized in a way that we end up having to, you know, that we end up assuming that it has to involve, you know, a flip chart or the digital equivalent of a flip chart, and the young people undertaking sort of, you know, structured activities in a structured sort of way. And I think that for me is one of the challenges of it, is how do we stay intentional? How do we stay purposive? How do we stay with the young people engaged in ways that also then allow them to be co-creators of the learning experiences and collaborators of the learning experience? And I think that's, for me, is probably one of the big challenges of the work, but also I think a challenge that youth workers who work from that very integrated So the head, heart, hands piece, that integrated piece, I think are well placed to meet those challenges. But I think we could very easily, you know, and I can understand the attraction of programmatic approaches or manualized approaches, you know, so that we have, well, we need to run a program on, and we take down the manual and we offer the program on. And I really understand the appeal of it on one level. But I think then is there potentially something being lost in that, in terms of how we relate to young people and their ownership of the processes. So I don't know if people have thoughts about that or comments or anything. It's very easy for Nora and I to sit here and on the basis of all of our conversation say, here's what we think. But I think it's important to create a conversation too.
Yeah, definitely feel free to unmute and contribute something. I think for me, the points that Hilary raised there lie in the methodologies and the skills, the hands part of the head, heart, hands. I think youth workers and the creative and innovative approaches that we take is a competence that really can be developed to tackle the scenario that Hilary just suggested there. And I know in my own case, I have turned to visual arts-based activities, a little bit of theatre, some spoken word. We all have tools that we're developing to create those learning spaces that don't become just another classroom in another space. And it's about finding balance, because I still think, and the young people that I've been working with really value that time of sitting around and reflecting and having group conversations, balanced with the more interactive and practical activities that we do as well. Would anyone like to say anything, or will I keep going? Okay.
Yeah, for me, I'm not a youth worker. I work in adult education and integration. So it can be more structured, I guess, because our clients are very clear on what they want to learn. So they have those learning objectives in their mind already, you know. But I do think taking ideas from non-formal learning kind of ways of doing things can be a really nice balance between the two. Like, you can have both. So I do find that trying to step away from the really traditional learning objective, get your flip chart out, and then, you know, being very kind of step 1, 2, 3 about it, can still be really helpful, even if you are being still very learning centered, and you might still get that flip chart out as well. But because we have a real focus on integration and community and clients helping each other as well as us giving them knowledge, I find that some of the non-formal learning ideas really, really helpful.
Super. Thanks a million, Alison. And that actually leads really well into the next slide, because we want to be really clear in that we're really advocating that we carve out space for these non-formal learning approaches, but that's not to say that we're not also advocating for creating space for informal learning and more structured learning when the time is right. It's really about being able to pull together lots of different learning environments to suit the needs of all the different types of learners. And I think this is a really good definition of informal learning. So it defines it as, from the learner standpoint at least, it's non-purposive learning, which takes place in everyday life context, in the family, at work, during leisure, and in the community. It does have outcomes, but they're seldom recorded, virtually never certified, and are typically neither immediately visible for the learner, nor do they count in themselves for education, training, or employment purposes. And there was definitely a time where I did not value this informal learning space as much as I do now. I've learned that the informal learning, when young people or learners just have time to hang out and conversate together, that's a space where they can really build confidence and a good dynamic, so that they're better able to engage in the non-formal parts of the non-formal parts of programs as well. And it's a real opportunity for the youth worker to develop strong relationships with the young people, as well as they building relationships with each other.
This for me warrants a whole other conversation and webinar in its own right, you know, because it's often the invisible work of youth work that is strongly relational, and every youth worker will have their story of the conversation at the back of the bus or whatever. It seems to be inevitably the back of the bus where something shifted, either in a young person's sense of themselves or in their sense of themselves in the world or in their relationship with the world. And the idea, I suppose, for us, really the key thing about any learning is that it's really important that at some point that awareness is brought to the consciousness of the learner, because there's no point us seeing the value of the learning or something that has changed in young people in terms of maybe their confidence or their creativity or their capacity if they can't see that for themselves, that they need to be able to articulate that. But Janet Batsleer in particular has written a whole book on informal learning in youth work, which I think is just a brilliant, brilliant text about exploiting, in the best sense of the word, the opportunities in the everyday contexts of youth work for informal learning. And Creators Not Consumers, a very oldie but a very goodie from 1980 from Mark Smith, is available on infed.org. That's really worth having a look at as well. But as I said, I think this warrants a whole other seminar in its own right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess from a practical perspective, going back to writing funding applications, Erasmus Plus and European Solidarity Corps really value the space for informal learning as well as non-formal learning. So not to forget about that in designing of activities is important. So yeah, we're going to look now at some of the guiding principles that inform non-formal education, and we're going to use Mentimeter again to do that. So pull back up your phones and log back into your menti.com. The same code will apply, and I'll just give another second for people to do that. And yeah, the question is, what are the guiding principles, the core elements of non-formal education? So this is just a brainstorm, and maybe the same concepts will come up again that came up in the values and the skills. What are the core elements of non-formal education, in your opinion? I really hope this isn't set on a timer. I don't think it is. Great, so we have contributions around discussions, personal experience, being open and honest, peer learning, questions, explorations, fun, outcomes, being flexible, objectives, person-centered with a light structure. Super. So you'll find that when we look at the principles that have been developed in the manual for non-formal educators, all of these concepts will appear. So we will send you the link to this manual, which will be of great interest. And it outlines the following characteristics of non-formal learning, specifically in youth work contexts and training events. So it's a planned learning process based on the needs and interests of the young people. It's the personal, social and political education for young people. It's designed to improve a range of skills and competences. outside but supplementary to the formal education curriculum. It's where participation is voluntary and starts from the interests and needs of young people, where programs are carried out by trained leaders. It's also about a freedom of choice, fun, creativity, participation, learning, activities, games, skills, experience, an easy way to learn, spontaneous learning, pleasure, doing, trying, others, different points of view and possibilities, freedom, more valuable information, learners contributing to the direction of their learning, and everything is possible. So again, there's lots and lots to consider there. And I imagine none of this is particularly new to you all, but it's good to refresh it and think about how you're designing programs that incorporate these characteristics. So how do people feel about those characteristics? Does anyone want to contribute or even critique anything that we've discussed? And you'll see that many of the concepts that came up in our own exploration of core elements are certainly captured in these characteristics. So it's not necessarily new knowledge for people, it's just really establishing a deeper and clear understanding. And I guess we can't have a conversation about non-formal learning without talking about recognition of this learning. And you'll all be familiar with YouthPass, which is the tool that's been developed by SALTO and the European Commission to recognise non-formal and informal learning in youth projects in both Erasmus Plus and European Solidarity Corps. And from a practical perspective, I find the resources I still use them in all projects to help me design the reflective part of projects and to really focus on certain competences. And in the projects that I implement using Erasmus Plus or European Solidarity Corps funding, we don't always address all of the competences in every project. We just sometimes pick a couple of them to really focus on, so that at the end of a project, young people can really share and articulate how they've developed competences in certain areas, I guess. And there's some wonderful resources, and we'll share them with you afterwards. That one there is one that I've been using quite a lot. And it's not on the slides here, but the other resource I think that you'll find useful is the National Youth Council of Ireland have developed the Capturing the Magic Toolkit to support the evaluation of creative projects that I think is really applicable to most youth projects.
And the other one we came across, and we'll put that up in the resources afterwards, is one called U-Train. There's an amazing amount of really brilliant work being done across European Erasmus sort of partnership projects, but it's a U-Train video project. It has a YouTube channel and a MOOC, but a lot of those are focused on non-formal education and how to do it, and really user-friendly sort of tips and that, because I think I'm just looking at the chats here that Derval's made a comment about, you know, the real value, I think, at looking at the sort of the learning opportunities, that activities is to start with the notion of intentionally searching out the learning activities or the learning potential in everyday activities, and doing that in a very sort of normalized way. So it doesn't go from now we're having fun, now we're doing learning, that actually that the whole thing is set up in a way that really, you know, explores and exploits, again, in the best sense of the word, exploit the opportunities for learning, but also in ways that are self-directed by the young people. I think that's really important. Somebody else earlier mentioned about I think it was Alison, about the flip chart, and I think those things are really important, but maybe the thing is what we should be doing is giving the flip chart to the young people, you know, is not assuming that we are the ones who have our ideas of education are very influenced by formal education because of its visibility. And the roles, when we think about educator, we might immediately default to teacher. And so we really, I think, have to very consciously take on a role as youth workers, as non-formal educators, and look at what does that actually mean in practice, and in some way, I suppose, moving into the space where we see ourselves as the facilitators of learning and trying to spot where those opportunities are and feeling comfortable in that space and seeing ourselves as co-creators of the learning with young people, rather than our traditional vision of the teacher who is the one with the knowledge that has to be passed. And in one of the notes earlier, somebody mentioned Frary. Of course, Frary is brilliant in terms of helping us to think about and the ideas about learning and critiquing traditional models of banking education and banking learning into more, and sort of challenging us to think about ideas about sort of liberation and transformation in learning, where the young person and the educator are both learners and educators together. And I think if we can allow ourselves to co-create with the young people, then it takes away maybe some of those concerns that we have about, oh, I don't know enough. I don't know enough about the subject. But actually, what we don't need to know everything about the subjects. What we need to be able to do is feel comfortable engaging young people in learning, and we can learn about the subject together.
Yeah, super. And I think Bell Hooks was also mentioned earlier, who kind of further expands on Frary's work, but considering a broader lens of feminist and more diverse perspectives. So there's just so much material to engage with and get your head around. We wanted also to highlight the education and training strategy. This is Erasmus Plus, the ETS competence model for youth workers. So they've listed these competences that all link to non-formal learning in some way. So competence for youth workers to work international, to facilitate individual and group learning in an enriching environment, in designing programs, in organising and managing resources, in communicating meaningfully, in displaying intercultural competence, in networking and advocating, and in developing evaluative practices. So we've kind of covered most of these competences in our discussion so far, and we wanted to highlight that there's really excellent tools to support your own. They're designed so that they can be used for you as individuals to reflect on your own levels of competences in these areas, and also to support peer exchange and support in developing competence. And Salto also run many trainings specifically focusing on these different competences. So that web link there will bring you to some of those resources that you might, if you can take time out for some deeper reflection on your own competences, these will really support you. And then Hilary has been leading this program for, I don't know how many years now. Hilary, do you want to give, and I need to stop share and I'll pull up the website as you're talking.
Yeah, so this is an example, I suppose, of some non-formal educational resources that were developed as part of a KA2 with partners in Finland, Estonia, Australia and Northern Ireland, and alongside then the National Youth Council in Ireland and the Youth Workers Association in Estonia, etc. And the idea was that we would develop modules, online digital resources that are free and open access to, and those modules there give you an idea. So we built the modules around these 5 topics, and they are each one of them is made up of a video, a short video that you can just watch through, but a longer video that has an interactive element and a downloadable PDF. So those are on some of the key topics in youth work, and we are actually delighted to say that we have an opportunity now to expand the modules. So we're hoping to add modules around international youth work and development education and global youth work. So we see it as a growing resource. But one of the modules, we thought the one that Nora is pulling up there might be particularly useful for you. So that's one on youth participation and non-formal learning. And I suppose for us, of course, the two go hand in hand, that non-formal learning is predicated on young people's voluntary participation, and that not just participation as in taking part, but participation across whatever model you use so that they become collaborators and owners of the experience. And the whole website is based around the sort of reflective practice idea of watch, read, reflect and act. So it might be something that's useful to you individually or collectively in small teams to look at. The other bit that I wanted to bring your attention to is the very last tab, which is called Sources and Resources. And what we've done there is we've tried to collect across a whole range of things, sources of information, so the head stuff, the thinking about, but then also sources for practice, resources for practice around a whole range of topics. And all of those topics, for instance, so I mentioned earlier, creators, not consumers, those links are to those, as people might be aware, the Centre for Effective Services brought out a series about in theory and in practice in relation to youth work. So these are all free, open source, web-based resources. So I think one of the challenges we find, of course, is that there's a huge amount of really, really good information out there, but it's also sometimes really hard to find. So what we've, I suppose, both tried to do in today's session, and then what we're trying to do in youthworkinu.org, is to curate your resources, is to bring resources together and to add to it on an ongoing basis. So that's something that might be useful, but is also an example, I suppose, of a non-formal resource.
Yeah, super. And we have just a couple of other resources that we felt would be worth. Is this sharing with you now? Have I shared the screen? Sorry, I've lost track. Can you see YouthWorkinu on your screen? No. Oops, okay, sorry.
It popped out.
Yeah, so some other resources that we thought we should bring to your attention was this manual for facilitators in non-formal education. It's super, and this is where we pulled those characteristics from. They're all available online. This was developed by Key Action 2 Strategic Partnership Programme a number of years ago, and it's a really practical manual to use both in the design of programs and as a reference for your research in writing funding applications. And this is the compendium on non-formal education, also published by Council of Europe Youth Partnership. So it's also an excellent reference, particularly from the theoretical perspective and in defining and understanding the ideas and concepts informing non-formal education and learning. And I guess in time, hopefully we'll have another publication to add to this, which is the paper that Hilary and I have been collaborating on. It will be called Focus Learning, and hopefully will be launched later in the year. So if you see publicity around that on Léargas social media or Salto, you can connect it back to this conversation. Yeah, we're going to fly through, there are trainings specifically connected to non-formal learning and the ETS competence model. So the best way to become aware of them is by signing up to Léargas newsletters and following their social media accounts. But specifically, there's one that's run a couple of times a year in various countries. Different national agencies host it around Europe, called The Power of Non-Formal Education. And that's a really good space, particularly I think for newcomers, to connect to the concept of non-formal education and to learn practical tools and activities for designing programs as well. People coming from creative organizations who are not specifically youth work organizations find this a really good one to bridge that gap between using creative methodologies and in the context of non-formal education. So there was one due to go ahead in Georgia later this month, and that's been postponed, and hopefully as things return to normal or new normal, we'll see this being advertised either again in Georgia or in an online version. Yokomo is another one to keep an eye out for. This is the one that really explores the competence model for youth workers, and they select different competences for different Yokomo trainings. So these are happening a couple of times a year as well. And it's just one to check in on if there's specific competences that you'd like to develop. Yeah, this is our last slide. It's 11:25 now, so we're remarkably on schedule. So I wonder, do anyone have any questions or comments, or perhaps there's some follow-up questions that we'll respond to after this time together. So please feel free to post. And I know that Audrey also has an evaluation that she'll be sharing with you afterwards as well, or after this. But please feel free to write any questions, critiques, comments here, please. We'll give a couple of minutes to see what comes up. No questions.
Any comments or thoughts about, you know, from this about people? Because I think there's a real, I'm wondering if there's like an appetite to share good practices or to I suppose develop our own, you know, I don't know, compendium or place to gather resources, or to think about how we could, I suppose, use these ideas also to develop the identity of youth work in Ireland. And I'm very conscious there's that, you know, non-formal learning and education don't only belong to youth work, but I suppose given my particular set of interests, I have a youth work focus. But whether, yes, there's an appetite to explore more of this and more of these ideas about how we as youth workers articulate our practice and develop our identity as educators and articulate that in a much more defined sort of way.
Yeah, and I think as well the importance of peer support. The conversations that I've been having with Hilary have really reconnected me to things I'm really passionate about, and to inspired lots of ideas for how I go about my own practice and where I should be sourcing information. So I had found I'd become completely disconnected to a space to have those conversations. So I'm really pleased to find myself back here, and think yeah, that maybe other people experience that as well, that there's no space to have those conversations.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Hilary and Nora. Sorry, this is very unusual for me. Normally I'm a talker, but I've just realized on this digital format, I'm really like silent. But thank you, it was really good. But Nora, I think I can only sort of echo what you're saying. I think often, one, we become a little bit complacent, and two, we get caught up in our funders and what we have to do and our targets. And I think it'd be really nice to have that conversation, because I think genuinely at the heart of majority of youth workers, these are the values we have, is around this sort of non-formal education. And I think we need to be talking about it a bit more again, especially in the current times, you know, where we're going to be seeing, I think, a bit more of sort of reactive again, and crisis management. And so I think it's really important that we are, and I think it's important as well when we lose sight. And only recently I managed to do a transnational youth initiative, with young people, wrote the application, and it was just felt so good. It just actually felt, again, getting back in touch with, you know, why you're doing this, what we are educators, and actually what's the purpose of what we're doing. So I think it would be really nice to have that conversation in a bit more detail, and actually sort of start talking about it and start using the words educators within the sector, because we often don't mention it. I think we need to be saying that's, you know, that's part of our role and who we are. We're young people.
I agree. I think a competence that as a sector we need to really improve on is advocating on our own behalf, and the importance and the impact of our work. And yeah, someone wrote there that youth workers were considered non-essential workers during COVID. The youth work, they went online overnight. They were supporting people and their families throughout the entire crisis, and it hasn't been receiving the recognition it deserves. So perhaps we do need to work on some platform where we're shouting from the rooftops in a really beautifully creative manner that our role as educators is essential.
I think NYCI have commissioned a small piece of research to look at some case studies in how youth work has done that, because I think that's the thing, is we are remarkably creative, remarkably resilient, you know, remarkably have a huge capacity to be there for young people at a minute's notice. And yet there's a reluctance to articulate and to speak for ourselves in a very overt sort of way. And I do think that, you know, there is, I think, real potential to create some connections between, and they are connections, of course, that are lived in projects and in communities between, you know, adult and community education and youth work and community development, but something about articulating that much more, you know, definitively, I think, can only help us in a context where our where our practice is being shaped very directly by policy priorities and various and associated funding streams.
Yeah, and the comment has come up there that it is likely that funding will be cut after COVID, and I guess Léargas are and will be supporting beneficiaries on the ground to really access Erasmus Plus and European Solidarity Corps to somehow resource youth work going forward. The need will be there, and we can only imagine the youth unemployment figures that are going to appear, and it's something I've been noticing in the last couple of months. The needs from the young people I've been working with have changed. Now I only work with a small group at the moment. It's capacity is a bit of an issue, but they were looking for, because they lost their jobs, they had to move apartments, they were panicking over lots of things, and it came back to them asking me for their youth pass certificates, for references, for helping them to write up things that they'd learned and experienced, and it just really reinforced the importance of that side of things, the recognition of learning and documenting the impact carefully so that we could go back to it. Breathing Space is the organisation here. We're kind of new, and I've no website yet. It's a work in progress, but we're on Instagram, and it shares some of the impact to date if you want to have a little look at that sometime. But yeah, we probably haven't got time for any more. Thanks so much for being here. I think it's such a valuable space and conversation, and I feel so passionate. I get buzzed up after I have these conversations. Audrey, do you want to
just before everyone heads off, it would be really great if I have a mentee just to kind of evaluate the day and how you felt about it. So it's mentee.com, but it's a different code. I'll share it now. So it's 711959. Yeah, it'd be really helpful just so that I think we're hoping to maybe roll out more of these. So it's really useful for us to gauge what people make of them. So I'll share my screen now. Should only take a couple of minutes. Okay, so does everyone see the mentee?
Yeah, we see it.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So the first question to answer is if you could rate the quality of the program, the quality of inputs, and the quality of the practical application. So there's strongly disagree and then strongly agree. Let's give it another minute. If anyone has any issues accessing it, please let us know in the chat, or even just you can unmute your mic and let us know. Okay, we will move on to the next slide. So, what element of the training did you find most useful? Some nice responses. Reignite the fire. I like it. Are we good to move on? Yeah? We'll leave another minute. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. So what other topics would you like to see addressed by Webinar Wednesdays? So there's a few things that came up obviously at the end there. So if there's something in particular that you think would be really valuable for us to host through Webinar Wednesday, please let us know. Or maybe something that didn't come up today, could be something totally different as well. Project management tools, yeah, that's a good one. So maybe something around street work kind of thing. I assume that's the street corners, yeah. Okay, I will move on to the next one. And then any of the, any part of the training that you found less useful, so what wasn't useful? Or just, yeah, less. That's good. Maybe if you could just give me a thumbs up if you're ready to move on to the next one, it'd be helpful. Like either through a reaction or through your screen. Cool. Have a couple. We'll move on. And then would you engage in online training during the summer months? So we're just about to head into the summer. This is the time where most youth services would be busy with summer programs or else, you know, closing off for a couple of weeks. So let us know if you are interested over the summer months and whether we should host them or if you think it's better to wait until the typical time when we would have training, like in autumn. I think option 3 could be, I think that should be not sure, a non-committal one. So there's yes, no, or option 3. Okay, I'll move on. I think that's, yeah, any other comments? So if you've any other thoughts or comments that you wanted to add? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but you can continue to add, the Menti will still be open, so you can continue to add any comments. and we should all be able to see them as well. I'll stop sharing. I'm just conscious that some people have left and we are a little bit over time, so I don't want to keep anyone here any longer than they need to be. But yeah, thank you everybody for attending, and we do really appreciate your feedback. These events are really about you as organisations and your needs, so any kind of feedback is really valuable. And then just to say as well, I know there was some mention of, like, you know, kind of the need for conversations and stuff like that. This is something that's come up with a few different training events that we've had, where organisations feel like there needs to be like a not almost like a network maybe that can come together and have these kind of discussions. So if people are interested in having a group or something, because that's one thing that is really missing from these online events, is you don't really get to network, you don't really get to have the chat and swap emails and things like that. So if there is an interest there, please let us know. We can try and host or facilitate something like that, if that is a need. Yeah. Thanks.